Welcome to this webinar tonight, the sixth in a series of 7 on reimagining government. Subject of tonight's webinar is Reorient to Learning. What does that mean, to reorient towards learning? We hear a lot about how in life, the one way that we learn is through failure. Yet that seems to be the hardest thing for governments to actually do. So can governments learn from failure, and how? These are some of the questions we'll look at in this evening's webinar. And to answer those questions, we've got a terrific panel. Sarah Hurcombe is Director of Human-Centred Design at the New South Wales Treasury. Dr Toby Lowe is Visiting Professor in Public Management at the Centre for Public Impact. And Dr Subho Banerjee is Research Program Director at ANZSOG. All 3 panellists have extensive public service experience. The most popular question tonight is question 4. What do you see as being the main barriers to a learning approach, and how might we begin to address those? Sarah, I'm going to start with you. Sarah, can you tell us, how would you answer that question? What do you see as the main barriers to a learning approach in government? And as you do, Sarah, do you mind telling us a little bit about the human-centred design in the New South Wales Treasury? What do you do, and perhaps how does it relate to this question?
Hi everyone. I just also like to acknowledge that we meet today, many of us, on the lands of the traditional owners, and that it hasn't been ceded. And I'd just like to pay my respects to past, future and emerging leaders, and to acknowledge that I've learnt many things from my Aboriginal colleagues or peers over the years, some of which we'll probably get to today as we start to talk. So I'm a director in New South Wales Treasury. I've been here for about almost 2 years actually, which is just crazy when I think of how quickly that time has gone. It still feels very much like I'm in the early days of what we're doing here. Originally, I came on board as a bit of an experiment. I came on covering someone else's secondment and set about really quickly thinking through how could we bring ways of working which acknowledge and bring more focus to those that use services, those experience systems, those that use products that government funds and provides in New South Wales. I'd never worked at the heart of a treasury before, and it's human-centred approaches don't naturally seem to fit within a treasury, but that's also why I think it's really important that there's a small team like mine working in there to start to think through how do we bring in and balance out some of the hard analytical quantitative data with some of the qualitative stories and experiences of people using the services that we fund and design here in government. So in terms of the topic, definitely I'm learning some of the barriers whilst being a little bit experimental in the space that I'm working in. And the way that we work is we work in partnership with other government agencies to think through how do we achieve outcomes in the services and the systems that we fund in government and design. How do we do that by taking a systems lens, not just thinking about the service that we're particularly funding or designing, but how do we think of the wider system, not only of government, but the NGO world out there, the for-profit world, but also people's busy lives and the knowledge and the experience that they bring to this place. So I think in terms of key barriers, some of the things for us definitely is that time is building in the practice to learn as we're going and doing. Having to build as a leader of a small team who is quite different from the context that we work in. We work with a lot of economists and analysts that come from a quantitative background, to how do I create that space for my team to bring in their different design and research skills into that environment that is pretty foreign and which is assessing us in a particular way, and we don't fit that mold quite often. So I think in terms of the barriers to that have definitely been some of the fear that we bring by being different into a space, by trying things that are different. We bring that in ourselves. There's a lot of fear at failure, I think, in government, and that happens at all levels, from the top, from ministers down to public servants. And that comes from a number of places, from the general public who want things solved now and things often done in a simple way. Don't tell me how complicated it is, just get on and do it and achieve those outcomes, to the media, but also to peers. I think there's a lot of pressure on us in government to because we have that public responsibility for achieving good, but it's also, I guess, the counterbalance of, well, who gets to determine what that good is, and how best do we deliver some of those things. So I think definitely for me, that personal fear of failure, as much as I have failed many times in my career and life and always do, there is that personal fear of, oh, I should have seen that, or oh, I've only done something differently. You feel it from your peers, you definitely feel it from the system. But also I think we often don't make that time and space to learn and reflect as well. So part of that is also what's on us to stop doing, to create that space where we can build up a practice of learning and reflection, to shift it away from blame and actually go, well, what can we learn from this?
Thanks.
So,
that's really great. Just before I throw to Toby on this, can I just stay with you for a second, Sarah? Can you give us an example of where you've taken, if you like, a learning approach to a particular challenge, and or a time when you felt that you know you have failed in one way, and what did you learn from that?
So, I mean, we've applied it. I've tried to create that in our team, definitely. So we've built our own theory of change for what we do. So it's kind of something that we've mapped out. We've come together to go, well, what are the outcomes we want to achieve, and how do we think about how we work to understanding whether we're progressing towards achieving those outcomes. What are the kind of metrics that we want to put around that? And a lot of them are qualitative. It's seeking that feedback from people. So that in itself is often quite a confronting thing, we've found, with colleagues, with peers that we work with, to actually go, no, I honestly want to know what you think about us. I want you to tell me we're okay. And I think I've learned that. I don't come from a design background. I've probably come more from a traditional policy making background with a law and a history degree. But my design colleagues have definitely taught me that process of being open to not having all the answers as well. And so I guess we bring that into all the projects we do, even in the process of going, let's learn from this workshop we did, or this piece of the milestone that we reached. How do we actually know, and helping people be okay that we're not going to take that feedback and use it against them, or use it in a different way. In terms of, I've been trying to get components of developmental evaluation up into some of the projects that we're doing. We're doing a lot of early stage design work, and trying to get that up. I have been unsuccessful in getting a funded position for that, because I forgot the political context I was working in. And so we'd had the permit, and it's that constant learning, I guess, of going, yes, theory, this sounds really good. I've got all my stakeholders at a lower level on board, but then it goes out to the world and you're like, I forgot about the minister. I forgot COVID environment. I forgot this. And you just sometimes forget that, I think. So, yeah.
Thanks, Sarah.
Failure.
That's a great start. Toby, what is your response to this question about governments reorienting to learning? Are they doing that? If they're not doing it, why are they not doing it? What obstacles lie in front of that change, do you think?
Thanks, James. So in the work that we've seen, and particularly in public service, the biggest obstacle
we've been the Centre for Public Impact, you mean?
Yes, we've been the Centre for Public Impact, and previously my work at Newcastle Business School, doing kind of action research in this area. And across all of the contexts that we've seen, the biggest obstacle for governments, and particularly, I'm going to particularly talk about public service here, for public service to learn, is the performance management mechanisms that are used to manage both kind of people, teams, and organisations, and particularly the way that those performance management mechanisms are embedded in the funding that is distributed throughout kind of public service systems. And performance management works to undermine learning in those contexts in a couple of different ways. Firstly, it undermines the processes of learning itself, because if you have target-based performance management of any form, doesn't matter whether those targets are outputs or outcomes or anything else, if you have target-based performance management, the overwhelming evidence is that it creates gaming in a system. So essentially, people are making up data in all sorts of different ways in order to satisfy the targets that they've been set. And what that means is that the data that is flying around the system is fundamentally untrue. And if your data is corrupted in that way, it becomes impossible to effectively learn from that data and from that information. And then the second way that performance management undermines processes of learning is that it kind of corrodes a culture of learning, because learning starts from a kind of admission of not knowing and a culture of curiosity and, ooh, what's happening here? And particularly when we performance manage for outcomes, what we're rewarding and punishing is knowing, it's results, it's success. And learning and curiosity is the very opposite to that, because in order to be curious, in order to learn, sometimes you have to make mistakes, sometimes you have to fail. And so that culture of fear that Sarah was talking about can be traced back significantly to outcome-based performance management processes. And finally, I think those performance management mechanisms undermine learning by restricting the people's ability to turn what they learn into action. Because if you're set targets from afar, whether that's by managers from higher up or by people in time, afar in time, essentially they're trying to control the behaviour and the scope of the action of public service workers. And so what that means is that they can't turn what they learn into action because it's outside the scope of their remit. Because when you genuinely allow people to learn, they uncover stuff that the people who set the targets and set that framework couldn't possibly have imagined. So those processes of performance management create a set of conditions where people go, oh yeah, we've learned all this, but we can't do anything about it because we're not allowed. So fundamentally, what we need to change if we're going to reorientate to learning is we need to completely rethink how we do performance management in government.
Really interesting, Toby. Subho, I'd like to just take you back one step, and before I take you on to what Toby has just said, why is it important that governments reorient towards learning? Perhaps we should define terms at the start. What is the goal that we're seeking to achieve here? And then after we've talked about it, you might talk a little bit about some of the potential obstacles that Toby and Sarah have talked about. Do you agree? Targets, outcomes, performance management, is that the problem? But let's start, if we can, with the what we're seeking to achieve, do you think?
Sure, thanks very much, James, and fantastic to join you all. Can I associate myself with James's acknowledgement of First Peoples at the start, and I won't repeat that, and kia ora to all our New Zealand colleagues who are on the call as well. James, I think thinking firstly about what are we trying to achieve here is a really good place to start, as it usually is. And I think getting our head around what learning looks like, what improvement looks like, really involves you thinking about some of the things that Sarah and Toby have already talked about. What we're doing in government is hard. We're dealing with complex, difficult, multidimensional problems, and overwhelmingly, when we're thinking about new solutions, we're thinking about problems we haven't cracked yet. So we don't know what exactly is going to work, and so by definition, that requires a bit of conceptual experimentation. And there are many other fields where we're very comfortable with that as a way of thinking. That's a very natural way of thinking in science. You've got a hypothesis, you're testing it out, you're seeing if it's going to work or not. There's no sense that 100% of hypotheses are going to be true. That's not the nature of hypotheses. You need to stretch the thinking out and then see whether or not it's going to work or not and test it empirically. Really, a lot of startup culture is much more, here's a neat idea, let's see if we can make it work. And in more fun arenas, a lot of sports coaching is about, well, let's try different things. Let's see if it works, or let's iterate, let's refine as we go. So I think we're actually quite used, and in the creative arts, when you hear people talk about movies or TV shows, they talk about having an idea and working on it together, seeing which bits of it work, which don't, and continuing to evolve that thought. And there's a sense in public service work, public policy work, where we find that kind of flexibility and moving back and forth extraordinarily difficult, and it's just counterintuitive. It goes counter to this idea of how you tackle difficult problems. And so I think that is a really serious issue, and I think the way Sarah and Toby have already talked about it is, how do you get the mechanisms inside the system to more replicate what we know are the ways of thinking that we need to address complex problems. So for me, that's the kind of problem statement. We're trying to do hard stuff, and to do hard stuff, we need to be able to think in these more creative, adaptive, flexible ways. And if we don't work out a permission space to be able to do that, we're not going to get there. It's just not going to work, because these are not simple problems to try and address. So if we think about what some of the barriers are, I think the first barrier for serving public servants, and I've seen this already in the chat, thinking about the broader political context is incredibly important, and it's completely proper. I'm speaking to you from Canberra. When we think about a Westminster-based system of government, accountability through ministers to the Parliament, the politics of experimentation are murderously difficult. In Canberra, Senate estimates and fronting Senate estimates is a really, really difficult, stressful situation where you are interrogated on the minute detail of various programs. Each of those programs, the questioning being on the basis of, in the way that Toby put it, what are the performance management indicators, and did you meet it or did you not? And any sense of not meeting it as being, well, you failed and that was bad. That line of logic is, in an adversarial contest, absolutely ubiquitous. It happens literally all the time. And so we need to grapple with that as the essential governing context, but we need to be clear-eyed about that, but also respectful of that as the governing context. These are accountability mechanisms that are important. This is about the expenditure of public money. It's about transparency of public processes. These are appropriate questions, but the manner in which this is developed has made it extremely difficult for public servants to think about experimentation, because it makes the incentives very asymmetric. As a public servant thinking about a creative, interesting way of doing things, you get very little of the upside generally. If it works, then that's great, and the credit is broadly spread, much as it should be, that's okay. And if it doesn't work, you bear a lot of the downside. And that can be very direct and very personal. So there's an asymmetry of risk in that for public service leaders, they need to think very, very carefully about how to operate in a situation where that risk is significantly asymmetric, where the governing context is in the way that we've described. And then I guess my bid from there is, how do you do the practical things within public service departments that provide a good space to be able to do this? How do you think about the right mechanisms? Sarah talked about finding the time and space to do learning practice, which is incredibly important. That's really the basis. How do you work with data and evidence in a feedback loop in a way that really allows you to keep learning? And then how do you get the leadership practices so that you are genuinely walking the walk, so that you are encouraging some ideas that are a bit different and really standing behind people when they have those ideas? That kind of broader ecosystem of what learning practice looks like is incredibly important, but it's got to be done in a way that is realistic about the governing context, and a lot of and with a kind of proper respect that a lot of that governing context is completely proper. We just need to think about how to make sure that we can do the things that we need to do within that context.
I think picking up just if I can, James, picking up the point around risk, that's also about how we view risk. So in some of the work we've done, and about ethics as well. So often when we've done some projects in the child protection space, there's been a concern around prototyping. There were some comments in the chat as well around how we don't prototype enough. And for some of the colleagues that we were working with there, that almost felt unethical to prototype, to test that what we were doing before we moved to implementation, because part of that was like, I have money, I should spend it. It needs to go out the door. So there is also this concept around where does risk come in, and how do we think about value in the public service and ethics as well that sits underneath some of these fears and some of the ways that we make those decisions about where risk lies. That's also why some of the approaches that we tend to take, and many of the projects we work on, as relatively small in scale to start off with. So which is also related to risk. So there's a whole heap of, as we all know, all the public servants on this chat will know, there's a whole heap of work that happens that ministers are really not that interested in or don't really want to know about. There is actually a whole heap of work that happens in government and opportunities in government that happen that is beneath the radar, that is potentially lower risk because we're starting small. It's still really complex, problem that we're solving, but how can we start this in a lower risk way to learn from what are the conditions we need to have in place to actually then go, right, Minister, we've got this idea about how we might want to do this on a bigger, high profile, more scale. And for my team, it was a bit of a risk, but that's how I wanted my team to start. I didn't want us working on something super big, super ginormous that there were multiple players on, because I had a brand new team. I didn't know how this human-centred design approach would work in a New South Wales government context. I needed to think about my context as well, and what actually would be the language and the types of ways that we talk about our work that would mean that the system wouldn't just reject us and go, you guys are not for us, you're off there. As some colleagues in Canberra described, one of the pieces of the work that DPC in New South Wales have picked up off the back of a chat with us. Oh, it's that hippy dippy stuff from New South Wales, so we've tried to also think through how do we position the work that we do that is about experimentation, that isn't a lot of the light and, it's not light and fluffy. This is about rigor. It's about hard practice. It's about getting your practices of learning right around it. It's not just doing some workshops with some post-it notes. It's actually building in some really rigorous practice about reflection, learning. What do we want to achieve, having those hard conversations? And that is just as hard as talking about risk. You're just trying to load it up earlier rather than later once you've spent all your money, and then you go, oh, oops, that was the wrong thing to invest in.
When risk kick in for you, Sarah? It's really interesting. I mean, you've made an optimistic point. As you say, a lot of things can happen in government that don't need to, go to the minister. They're not going to end up in the media. You can actually experiment quite a bit, but there comes a point, doesn't there, when you might think, I'm a bit worried about this. Maybe I need to send this upstairs. How does that process play out for you?
It does definitely play out. And I guess that's why the reflection and the practice piece is so important, because it's going, what are the options that you had in front of you before you made the decision and the pathway that you took? So if you've actually had that practice at the start to reflect on those things, then you've also got a narrative and an explanation for why you made the decisions that you made. It may have not ended up where you wanted it to, but you can, in that way, you can still explain why you chose the path that you chose. And again, picking up Subho's hypothesis-led approach, hypotheses or assumptions, mapping those very early in a project are really important, because assumptions aren't things that are just based on, a thought. They're actually often based on subject matter expertise, what we as government and our NGO and community partners have already done in this space before. We're then making decisions based on what we've already done, or the best of our ability to then make decisions going forward. I think often ministers are okay with that, not always, because sometimes they're not, but at least you've got a a reason for why you've made the decisions that you've made, rather than going, oh, it was an experiment. We didn't know, we just wanted to try something. That's not what we're talking about here as well. I think we're talking about rigorous practice and yeah.
Thanks, sir.
James.
Can I just throw to Toby for 1 second, because I'm really, Subho, I want to pick up Subho's challenge, Toby, about governing context. I think Subho's got a really important kind of parameters for the conversation tonight, because he said we have to be aware, not only have to know about the governing context, but to respect the governing context. The governing context is legitimate on part of ministers, secretaries, etc. Really keen to get your response to Subho's points there. And then perhaps also to ask you something about the evidence base, if you like, that we have for saying that management often represses, you know, the initiatives that come up, that it's just not in the KPIs. But let's talk first. I want you to respond to Subho, and then we'll go to the second question.
Brilliant, thank you. Yes, Subho's point about governing context is enormously important, I think. I like the word respectful, because that is, it speaks to me of starting from the reality of where we are now. And that's really significant. And and recognizing that the accountability structures that the forms of democracies that Subho was talking about have built are necessary and important aspects of how government works. And that's, I would absolutely agree that it is necessary to both respect and embrace those accountability structures. The bit of challenge that I would offer to that is that the form, the way that those accountability structures works, from our perspective, absolutely needs to change, because those accountability structures can work differently. They can ask different types of questions. And from our perspective, if we don't change those forms of accountability, then it makes it 1,000 times harder to reorientate to learning, because the culture of fear that gets created by those conversations that say, right from the top saying, have you hit your targets, trickles down right the way through organized. That culture of fear becomes pervasive and, as I was saying before, is corrosive to learning. So what we can do with that, and we need to remember that the doing accountability by holding people to account for hitting targets is a choice. It's not a natural form of accountability. It's not some kind of natural law. It's a choice that people make about how to do accountability, and they can choose to do accountability differently. So it is perfectly possible for the Senate Estimates Committee to, instead of ask people, okay, did you hit your targets for this, that, or the other, to ask an accountability question that says, what did you learn? And tell us, like, we want to hold you to account for the rigorousness of your learning practices and processes. And if you can't tell us both how you learn and what you've learned, then that's what we're going to hold you to account for. So it's perfectly possible for those accountability processes to work in that way. And also what's necessary is that we should be turning those accountability practices around on people like the Senate Estimates Committee, because we should be saying, and this is kind of connecting to your point about evidence, the evidence is overwhelming that form of target-based performance management undermines effective public service practice. There was a question in the chat about what's the evidence. I could spend the entire rest of this webinar kind of linking to papers that describe.
Don't get Toby started.
Exactly, don't get me started. And so one of the things from that is we should be asking people who choose to do accountability in that way, why are you making that choice? And we want to hold you accountable for making the choice to do accountability in that way, because if you're making that choice, you're making that choice against the best available evidence. And that's the kind of choice for which we should hold people to account, right?
If I can just jump in there, Toby, what Subho's talking about is in the Senate estimate system is the Westminster system, two parties that are trying to kill each other. looking for any opportunity to expose incompetence, malpractice in government. How do we make the change? I think everything you're saying, people would say, absolutely, I agree. But what are the steps of getting where we are now to that better system? What are the realistic steps?
And this is where Sarah's point about starting with something that's kind of small enough and out of the way enough that it's allowed to be experimental. And the framing, where we've seen this successful is where that idea of an experimental space extends to the accountability itself. So in something that's kind of small enough and out of the way enough that when things go wrong, because if you're trying, Subho's point about complexity was spot on. When you're trying something in a complex space, things will necessarily not work as you expected. It's the nature of what working in complexity means. So when things go wrong, it's a small enough and out of the way in space to for that to be okay, but also making sure that those people who are doing the accountability are part of the experiment themselves. So one of the things that we're doing is we're exploring with governments around the world, but let's make the experiment, let's make part of the experiment the accountability mechanisms themselves. So if we're experimenting with new forms of government, with doing accountability differently, that becomes part of the experiment. So in a bit of policy making that's kind of, as I say, small enough, out of the way enough to be allowed to try something different, make part of the experiment that the accountability for that is done differently. That when it comes to Senate Estimates Committee, instead of saying, did you hit your target, blah, 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 the question is, what did you learn? And if the answer is nothing, that is where the party political system of, what do you mean you didn't learn anything? Blah, 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 blah. That you can still do the cut and thrust of politics around that. It's just that you do the cut and thrust of politics around what you learn.
Thanks, Toby. That's great. Subho, I'd like you to respond to what Toby said, if you would, and the idea of accountability. Do you see Toby's proposal as realistic in the system that we operate under?
Sure, James. I mean, I think there's a lot more in common than is different, I guess, as I start the response, because I'm absolutely compelled by the analysis and the framing. And Toby, if I take particularly the point that there is something really obscene about the fact that this creates made-up data, and that there is a lack of understanding that just reaching in further and further, like when you're sitting in the centre, you think reaching in further and further gives you more granular information, and actually there's a lot of evidence that says that is not true. Even people in good faith just don't have the capability or the way to look at outcomes at the degree of granularity that is then requested. And so we don't have the conceptual bit of thinking that says at some point as you go further down, your information smudges out so badly that it really can't be relied on in any way, shape or form. So I did some work in Cape York, and one of the examples we had there was government and Canberra and also Brisbane would put in place grant requirements for very small remote communities over relatively small amounts of money, and the administrative burden was enormous. And the fact that after a certain degree of complexity, that information becomes really extremely difficult to put any reliance on. And so one of our recommendations there was really to try and bring that up to a higher level, to take a bit of Toby's thing there, that to bring it up to a higher level, look at what is the purpose here, what is the overall point of what we're trying to do, set some measures at that higher level, and then do some more rigorous accountability at that higher level, where you do have a bit more capability and you can have that argument back and forth. So really having a much more nuanced and granular think about what the information means at different levels and what that means for accountability, I'm completely on board for. So the way of thinking about it, I'm very sympathetic to. I guess my next bit then is, well, how do we try and make that happen? And I think in making it happen within the current system, that requires a lot of detailed and careful work to think about the mechanisms. And I think that is really hard. I mean, if we take the kind of Max Weber quote, we're in slow boring of hard boards now when you're thinking about how to make it happen, particularly in larger organisations and larger systems. And although, again, and I say this in complete sympathy, the idea of doing innovation at a small enough scale that's out of the way, that gets things going, I've done that. I completely get why we're in that situation, but it's not mainstream change, right? By definition, you're kind of hiding it away. And I remember a colleague saying how struck she was going to an awards ceremony, an innovation awards ceremony, and basically every person that got an award said, I'd like to thank my manager for hiding me for long enough to be able to do this really creative work. And she was saying to me that that's really troubling, that's not okay. We're not getting to the kind of mainstream mechanisms in a direct enough way to really have a crack at it. And so for me, then I'd kind of come back into Sarah's point that a lot of what we're talking about is just better practice. This is a better way of doing public service. It's a better way of doing public policy advice, and trying to argue for that mainstream case as well, that being reflective produces better advice. Having a data feedback loop produces better advice. Now, I'm not dumping on the idea of doing small things that are a bit out of the way. I have absolutely done that as well. But I'm just saying that when we do that, we need to be conscious that is accepting from the start how countercultural that is, and that we need to be also keeping in our mind how to get the mainstream system to be more accepting of these different ways of thinking.
Subho, very quick question to you. We're about to go to chat groups in a moment. Are you saying that there are no large examples, in your view, of governments that have taken a risky learning-based approach that might have failed, where it was in public, potentially in public view? Are you saying the examples of that are quite rare?
I think the examples are very rare. And I do think, I mean, you're asking, James, and pushing. I think if I go to Toby's point, the better question to ask is, did you learn anything? But in practice, are senators ever going to ask that question? Like, not in our foreseeable kind of, horizon, because that is not where the points are. That is not where the hit is. That is not how you get into. Now, I say that holding two thoughts together, right? That is the better question. How can we think about how to get that better question as the more respected form of asking these sorts of questions? And that, I think, is the tension. James, I wouldn't be so bold as to say there are no examples. I'm sure there are many examples. And there are, we have a very international audience. I'm sure through the chat we'll hear about many examples. I'm just saying it's murderously difficult. And that particularly in a very highly contested political space, such as we have in Canberra, what comes with that degree of contest is that every marginal bit of advantage is pushed very, very hard. And we need to be conscious of that. And my loop back around to that is Sarah's point, that we need to make the case that this is a better way of doing things. This will lead to better programs, better outcomes. It is better government performance. And that is why, Minister, this is worth you thinking about. This is why you should back us in to think about the world in this way.
Sarah, can I just start with you, asking you about, we've got a lot of challenges out of this first session about where we go from here. We're all agreed that learning is, Subho went through a whole range of areas where learning failure, learning again is seen as a very sensible model. And we might just think about how do we take that further? How do we persuade people who need to be persuaded, our ministers, our bosses, that is the right approach? And does COVID make it an easier environment, do you think, or a more difficult environment? I'll start with you, Sarah, and then we'll we'll go from there.
Sure. So I think in terms of some of the conversation we had earlier about, I think someone's put a comment in here about lurking in the shadows. It definitely wasn't what I was suggesting. I think what it is, though, is more starting small with big ambitions. So I think you still need to have a bigger vision for how you want to move it out from more of a trial and error, smaller, lower risk space until you build your muscle of experimentation and selling it and getting the conditions right. That's what I'm talking about there. Not so much that you are just working on the small things that don't matter to the system or aren't structural. I just think we need to be humble around the learning that we need to do as practitioners to know how to successfully work with partners and navigate it through a space. I also think part of it as well is knowing that experimentation isn't going to be the right approach for every problem we're trying to solve. So I think we, those of us who like to experiment and practice in this way, also need to recognise that sometimes we kind of do know enough to go, and it's partially that thing of what is complex and what is complicated. Some things are complicated and we can draw on good practice, we can draw on work that we've done in other similar places and apply it to this context. We still might need to learn about the context we're applying it to, but we're not experimenting everything. So I think it's also for us to be really clear about what exactly are we experimenting on. Is it the whole process? Is it the solution? Is it applying it to a new context? I think in that way, we're also thinking about where is the risk. So it's partially not saying, oh, we just want to experiment everything and it's the way that we must do it. I think you also have to be quite clear on what you're wanting to actually test and be upfront around that. In terms of communicating, I guess one of the ways that I have tried to apply in a Treasury context is to say it helps us reduce the risk of spending money on something that isn't desirable for people, isn't going to help them achieve the outcomes and the goals that they want to achieve. So part of that is also, like with anything, it's part of that is thinking. I've worked a lot with ministers over the course of my career as well. My very first job was in New South Wales Parliament, of all places, working on select committees. And then went and did the same kind of thing in government, working in London government, in scrutiny roles where we were scrutinising decisions of the mayors of London. So Boris Johnson was there at one of those times, as well as Ken Livingstone. So I worked a lot with different politicians whose role it was to kind of work on select committees. And I guess all I can say is, like with every minister, know what they care about, know what they're interested in, think about how, like with their people as well, right? That's what I always think about. You're talking about someone, what are the things that they're really willing to take a risk on and go, look, this is worth the risk because of the potential impact, or how I can tell a narrative about the impact that I'm wanting to make in my own career as well. I'll leave it there.
That's great advice. Thank you, Sarah. Toby, let me ask you, Paula White has said, you never change the system by fighting the existing reality. You might have read that in the chat. What you do is build a new model and then let the world catch up with that new model. Do you agree with that, Toby? And what are the elements in your view of that new model? And especially around the question of measurement. You've talked a lot about measurement. The performance management framework is really a measurement framework, isn't it? So how do we change that?
Indeed, and I was nodding more vigorously than you can imagine when I saw Paula's comment come through, because we are talking about a paradigm shift in how government works, and how, from the way I would describe it is, it's a paradigm shift in how public management works. So there's a set of choices that people make currently about how public management works. They can make different choices, but the way that paradigms work is that people are kind of locked into that way of thinking, and you'll never persuade someone who's locked into one paradigm to work differently. Because the nature of paradigms means that they ask different questions and they assess evidence differently. So there's nothing that you can show people that, like, oh, this evidence says we should do that, because they're almost literally blind to it. So what you do, exactly as Paul says, if you want to change paradigm, you create an alternative story, And then you provide examples of that story in practice that you can point at to go, see, isn't this working better? And so there's a beautiful thing from a systems thinker called Janella Meadows that exactly backs up Paula's point. She says, don't waste a single second trying to convince a skeptic, because you'll never do it. It's entirely a waste of energy and effort. Build something different. So create examples of the new story in practice in whatever size permission space that you can muster between you and a coalition of the willing. If you build something that different and you're right, then it will be better and people will see that and people will come to join in.
And
so that,
can you give an example, of that then from your experience, something that you've seen where people have gone and built the new paradigm and it's been successful?
I mean, so one of the case studies that we've looked at is Plymouth Council in the UK. So they decided that they were going to, a small group of people initially decided that they were going to do something very different in terms of the commissioning of their services for vulnerable adults. So people who've experienced homelessness, people who have mental health problems, people who've experienced domestic violence, all that kind of interdependent, complex series of challenges that people face in their lives. And they decided that they were going to commission a whole system response to this rather than the individual services that they'd done before. And over a process of about 4 or 5 years, moved from the traditional commissioning, target-based scrutiny accountability approach to where they were able to do an £80 million 10-year commission with no KPIs. And they commissioned a system of 10 organisations with a whole network beyond that, where the accountability requirements was to learn and collaborate effectively together. And they built a whole set of new scrutiny arrangements around it. So the councillors and the committee become part of the learning process and hold those accountable for learning. So all of the things that I was describing before aren't kind of theory, they're built on exactly that practice. So, and that was at a local government scale, but that local government scale has politics and people who are contest, and it's a really kind of contested part, like political part of the world. So the councillors fight each other in exactly the ways that people, but we know because they've done it, that it's now possible. And now we have that example and a growing number of others to point at. Now those people who want to work in that way can say to the others, well, have you seen this? Doesn't that look like a better way of doing things? And those who are curious are able to join in, blah, 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 and a critical mass grows, and all of a sudden it's the new normal. And all the previous skeptics are now rushing to catch up because that's what everyone else is doing.
Thanks, Toby. And Thea's put a link in the chat to that case study. Subho, what role do you think COVID is playing in this? Is COVID, Gerarda has asked a question about whether COVID increases the possibility for innovation in the current moment, or does it make it harder? What's your view?
It's a really interesting question, James. On the one hand, I think it has clearly shaken up existing ways of working, and that gives you some opportunities immediately, and that's a good thing. So I think, again, in Canberra, in the APS, there have been examples of mobility, people working quickly in different ways in different places, and I think that's been fantastic. I think there have been some learning practices in terms of being able to deliver things quickly and think about how you can move in different ways. And I know that the APS is doing a bunch of work to really capture that in terms of lessons learned and see which bits of that it wants to hold on to in terms of practice going forward. So I think times of great stress force you to work in different ways, and often that can lead to a degree of innovation through being forced to do so, and then being reflective yourself about which of those might be sustainable, or which of those are worth keeping is really worth thinking about. I think the most obvious one is this. You know, we are, I think, all much more comfortable dealing with each other virtually through Zoom or other video platforms than we were, you know, a matter of months ago. And we can have terrific conversations and terrific interactions, and it's transformed in the APS the way teams work together. and a degree of old-fashioned skepticism about how viable remote working might be has really just been blown away overnight. Actually, people can be very productive and they can think about their own choices about how they balance a range of different things. And I think in some personal psychological way, we've also got to know each other a bit better in teams as well. There's something nice about seeing people's kids or, you know, pets or something of their life that is a kind of different form of sharing that's actually really nice as well. Now that's not an unalloyed good. It's a move into the private sphere that for some people has been very difficult as well. But it's a different kind of conversation. And I think for people for whom it's worked well, and there are many people for whom it's worked well, it's really forced a change almost immediately. I think another COVID example in Canberra is specialist expertise and drawing on data and really valuing what kind of specialist evidence-based advice might look like. I think that's been really dramatically underscored by the COVID response. And again, I think thinking about what that might look like going forward is also really interesting. On the other hand, I think we will be in very tightened budget circumstances. And I think the kind of broader fiscal conversation, I think, is going to be extraordinarily difficult for some time to come. So, I mean, I think it forces changes in a way that then makes you think about the world in a different way. I think that's broadly been positive, but there are going to be some resource constraints that are going to bite in a very serious way.
Thanks, Subho. Toby and Sarah, let me throw this open to one of you. Both of you, feel free to jump in. How do you see the current moments in terms of the impact of COVID-19 on what you do and what you observe? Who would like to go first? Toby, do you want to start?
I'll go if you like. So yeah. One of the interesting things that we saw was that COVID is almost the pure platonic example that our world is complex, dynamic, and interdependent, right? So it brought the reality of the complex nature of our world front and center in an unignorable way. And it one of the the impacts of COVID are multi-dimensional and different in different places and at different scales. So there are as many lessons and takeaways from COVID as people who want to make write blogs about it. But one of the patterns that we saw was that people recognized that they were in a situation of kind of complexity and needed to move into a learning space. And so they turned off the instruments of new public management. So in the UK, NHS England financial targets were suspended immediately. Inspection regimes in education and the healthcare and social care systems got turned off immediately. They stopped doing those regular inspection regimes. Both public sector and voluntary sector grants. The granting organisation said to their grantees, if any of the targets or milestones that exist in your grants are preventing you from doing the things that you need to do now, we'll just turn them off. And that recognition that the tools of new public management, that target setting and monitoring and all that kind of business, do not work in complex environments, and the reorientation to learning that came about that, that's one of the things that I think we can hold on to from the COVID lesson, because the world has always been complex.
I'm going to cut you off there, Toby, because we're running out of time, and I want Sarah and Subho to wrap it up. If I can ask both of you to be more general, Sarah, but we're out of time to discuss COVID, but I'd like you just to think, unless you've got something you want to say about that, but otherwise just what do you take from this discussion about the biggest challenges required to get governments to orient towards learning? And then I'll ask you, Subho, to finish after Sarah. If we could just get 2 short responses.
Yeah, no worries. I guess seeing what's happened with COVID and thinking broadly as well, I think it depends. Sorry, it's contextual. So I see on some levels a narrative not changing. We're in some ways we're closing our borders smaller, whereas if we look locally, some of us have made connections with our neighbours in ways that we've never had before. I think that's probably going to be the case thinking about broader learning. I do think budgets are going to be tricky. So definitely the stuff that Toby was talking about in New South Wales, there has been some stopping of performance management approaches, but I would be very surprised if it doesn't come back in hard with a vengeance going ahead. So I'm half full, half empty at the same time. I see hope in lots of places, but often they're in small pockets and connections and relationships. But then when I think of structures and some of the things we've got dismantled, there's still a lot to do. But my hope is always in colleagues and peers and those pockets, those bright sparks where you meet people and go, okay, I can see that you're keen to make and try and learn something new and different, and we can partner on this together. Makes it easier in partnership.
Thank you very much. That's great. Subho, will you just very quickly wrap it up for us? What are your thoughts?
Sure. Thanks, James. The first point I'd make in reflecting on the conversation is there are ways of thinking that we need to develop and get better at. And in particular, we need to think about the upside and the downside of risk. We need to think about opportunity, and we need to develop our language around that much better. And I think that is genuinely for every single one of us. Next time we're watching the news and there's a supposed failure, catch yourself thinking, well, what were they trying to do? You know, what were they thinking in that decision, and what did it look like? So I think that's on all of us. I think the next point that is really interesting to me is to think about what can you do at a local level. All of us can think about in your own team, in your own organisation, what are some interesting and different ways to go about things. That was on the chat. I'm a huge supporter of that. Make a change where you are and think about different ways of working. And then lastly, James, I'm also a big supporter of being ambitious. I do think that this is such a fundamental issue that we should be aiming for mainstream change. And so that involves thinking about how we talk to ministers about it, how we think about the governing context, and how we are trying to talk about this thing more broadly to get the kind of change overall that we're looking for. But of course, I agree with both Sarah and Toby that often that involves starting, getting going, and doing good things at a smaller level to build your muscles and to build your capacity to do that.
Thanks, Subho. Look, I think this has been a brilliant conversation tonight. I want to thank Sarah, Subho, and Toby, because you've done two things. You've both gone to the difficult areas, and yet you've painted a vision of possibility about what might happen. These are really hard conversations. I think Subho's words, murderously difficult, have been quoted by a lot of people in the chat. That's stuck for a lot of people. So thank you to our panel.